Chapter 1. The Wolf on the Other Side of the Road. The deer had been dead for 3 days. Mara Voss knew this because she had driven past it every morning on her way to the school where she taught 7th grade English. Once, when it was still breathing on its side, like cycling uselessly against the frost-hardened shoulder of Route 9, and then twice more after it had gone still. The county would come for it eventually. They always did, eventually. But this morning, the carcass was gone. She slowed the car without meaning to, the tires crunching against the thin skin of overnight ice that had gathered at the road's edge. The spot was empty, scraped clean, almost. A smear of dark against the pale gravel was the only evidence that something had bled there. Mara sat with the engine idling, breath fogging in the cab because the heater had been threatening to quit since October, and today it had apparently followed through. She was still staring at the empty shoulder when she saw the wolf. It stood on the opposite side of the road at the tree line where the state forest began its long, unbroken run north toward the mountains. It was massive. That was the first thing her brain registered, before color or shape or any useful detail. Massive in the way that made her think her scale was wrong, that she was misjudging distance. Wolves in this part of Pennsylvania had been functionally extinct for over a century. What she was looking at was probably a dog, a very large dog. A dog that someone had badly mistreated and let run feral. But it didn't move like a dog. It stood with a stillness that was almost architectural, weight distributed, head level, not the anxious readiness of a domestic animal startled into the open. It watched her. That was the other thing. It was watching her with a directness that made the skin along the back of her neck contract, not the incidental attention of a creature that had noticed movement. Deliberate. Focused, as though it had been waiting for her specifically, and she had now arrived. Mara became very aware of the fact that her window was cracked 2 inches because the defroster was also dying. She reached for the handle, the wolf's head tilted. She stopped. They looked at each other across 30 feet of frost-pale asphalt for what felt like much longer than it was. The wolf's coat was dark. Not black, exactly, but a deep charcoal that caught no light, absorbed it instead. Its eyes were the pale, washed-out amber of old glass. And then it stepped backward, once, twice, with that same eerie composure, and the forest took it. Mara sat in the idling car for another full minute before she drove on. She told no one, because what would she have said? There was a wolf on Route 9. Tracy in the office next to hers would have smiled and said probably a coyote, and Mara would have had to agree because agreeing was easier than explaining that she knew what coyotes looked like, had been living 12 miles from this forest for 4 years, and that what she had seen this morning had looked at her the way a person looks at someone they recognize. The school day passed in its ordinary way. She taught the outsiders to a classroom of 12-year-olds who were either riveted or completely absent depending on which paragraph she was reading. She ate lunch at her desk. She drove home as the light was failing, the sky going the particular bruised purple-gray that November saved for its most hostile evenings. She almost missed the envelope on her porch step. It was a plain thing, no postage, no return address. Just her name on the front and handwriting that was cramped and angular and slightly too controlled, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write carefully on purpose. She opened it standing in the cold because she hadn't thought to go inside first. You should leave the road before dawn. They's been tracking the boundary. No signature. She stood there reading it twice, 3 times, turning it over. The back was blank. The paper smelled faintly of pine and something darker underneath, mineral and cold, like turned earth in winter. She looked down the length of her road. Her nearest neighbor was half a mile back through the trees. She'd waved to him twice in 4 years. The road beyond her property was empty in both directions, the kind of empty that felt less like absence and more like held breath. Mara went inside, locked the door, both locks, which she almost never used, and stood in her kitchen with all the lights on. They've been tracking the boundary. They, not it. Not singular. They. She set the note on the counter and made tea she didn't drink and tried to remember if there was anything about the wolf's eyes, specifically, that she might have misread. Whether she might be constructing a pattern out of unrelated things, a dead deer gone, an unusually large animal, an anonymous note from a neighbor who'd probably meant it to be neighborly and strange and nothing more. But she kept coming back to the tilt of the wolf's head when she'd reached for the window. That single, precise adjustment. The quality of its attention. She took the note to bed with her, lay in the dark listening to the trees move against the side of the house. At some point she slept, and her sleep was heavy and dreamless in the way of exhaustion, not peace, a heaviness that pressed her down below thought and held her there. She woke at 4 in the morning with the absolute conviction that something was standing at the edge of her property. She lay perfectly still and did not go to the window. She didn't know why she was so certain it was there, or what there meant, or what it wanted, or how she knew that it was not a threat. Not yet, not now. Only a watcher. But she was certain of all of this, the way you are certain of things in the dark that you can't explain in daylight. She lay there until 5, when the certainty faded, and then she made coffee and watched the frost on the window and thought about the handwriting on the envelope, cramped and angular and slightly too controlled. The morning that followed was ordinary. She almost believed that. Chapter 2, the weight of watched things. She started taking different routes to work, not because of the wolf. She told herself this firmly on the first morning, and then again on the second when she turned left onto Miller Road instead of right onto Route 9. Without consciously deciding to, it added 11 minutes to the drive. She used the time to listen to the radio and not think about Amber Eyes. By the third morning, she stopped arguing with herself about it. Miller Road ran parallel to the forest but set back further, the trees visible as a dark suggestion beyond the fields rather than a wall at the road's edge. It was more open. She could see further. She noticed she was checking her mirrors more than usual and made herself stop, and then noticed she'd started again without realizing. Thursday was the first morning she felt it. Not saw. Felt. She was halfway down Miller Road, coffee going cold in the cup holder. The sky, the flat gray of a held breath, before snow, when a sensation moved through her chest like a chord being struck, not painful, not pleasant, something more precise than either. Like recognition, like the particular quality of turning and finding someone already looking at you across a room. Except she was alone in the car. She checked the mirrors. Empty road, empty fields, tree-lined dark, and still in the distance. The feeling didn't leave. It rode with her all the way to school, settled into the space behind her sternum, and sat there through first period and second like a coin someone had pressed into her palm and then closed her fingers around. She didn't tell anyone. The town of Harlan's Creek had 1,200 people and very little turnover. Mara had been treated as new for approximately 2 years after she arrived, which was apparently the local threshold for newcomer status. And now she was simply there. Present. Known by face and first name, but without the deeper roots that came from having gone to school in the valley or having a last name that appeared on gravestones in the Lutheran churchyard. She existed in a social middle distance. This meant she noticed the man in the diner the way you notice anything that doesn't fit the established geography of a place you know well. She'd stopped at Patsy's on Friday afternoon for soup because the heater in her car had finally died completely and the drive home was going to be cold, and he was sitting in the far booth, the one in the back left corner where the light was worst and the bench was angled away from the room. He had coffee he wasn't drinking and nothing else on the table. He wore a dark jacket, collar up, and his hands were around the mug with the focused attention of someone who was using stillness as a discipline. He was looking at the wall. She ordered her soup at the counter and didn't look at him again. Tried not to. Patsy, who was actually named Donna but had been called Patsy since 1987 for reasons no one fully remembered, handed her the to-go bag with a weather update and a comment about the consolidated school board meeting on Tuesday, and Mara nodded in the right places and kept her peripheral vision aimed away from the far booth, like keeping your tongue off a sore tooth. She made it almost to the door. "The soup's better here on Fridays." His voice was low and unhurried and carried in the way of voices that were accustomed to not having to be loud to be heard. She stalked. Turned, because not turning would have been its own kind of acknowledgement. He was looking at her now, not at the wall. His eyes were a pale, washed-out amber. The coin pressed itself harder against her sternum. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. He nodded once, looked back at the wall. The conversation was apparently complete. She went to her car and sat in the cold with the soup bag on the passenger seat and her keys in her hand, and her heart doing something irregular that she was going to attribute entirely to surprise. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a few years more, the kind of face that was difficult to date because it carried something older in the set of it, a quality of weariness that didn't match the age. Dark hair. A jaw that was slightly too defined, too still, like he'd learned to hold it that way. Pale amber eyes. Obviously a coincidence, she told herself. Obviously. She drove home and ate the soup and did not think about it. She dreamed that night about the boundary. Not about anything in particular crossing it, only about the boundary itself. A line in the forest floor she understood without being shown, a seam between two kinds of dark. She was standing on the near side. The understanding in the dream was not frightening. It was more like being handed a map of a place you'd been walking through blindly. Here, the dream said. This is where one thing becomes another thing. She woke at 4 again. This time she did go to the window. The moon was nearly full and the frost on the field behind her house was bright enough to read by. The tree line was 100 yards back, clearly visible, and for a long moment she saw nothing, just silver light on cold grass and the black wall of the trees and her own breath making ghosts on the glass. Then at the edge of the trees the shadow moved, not dramatically, not threateningly. A shift in the weight of the dark, a shape resolving out of the tree line's edge and stopping there, exactly there, at the boundary between forest and field. It sat, she could see that much. It sat the way the wolf had stood on Route 9 with that infuriating, absolute composure, as though it had all the patience in the world and was prepared to use it. They were 40 yards apart. She was inside, backlit by the amber glow of the lamp she'd left on in the hallway. It could see her clearly. She should have called someone. Animal control. A neighbor. She should have, at minimum, stepped back from the window. She didn't. She pressed her palm flat against the glass, which was cold enough to ache, and watched the shadow at the edge of the trees, and the watching was its own strange answer to something she hadn't known she was asking. After a time, the shape stood and turned, and the forest closed behind it without a sound. Mara stood at the window for a long time after. In the morning, she would drive to school. She would teach the outsiders. She would stop at Patsy's maybe, or maybe she wouldn't. She would tell herself that the amber eyes in the diner and the amber eyes on Route 9 were a coincidence that any rational person would dismiss by noon. She knew she wouldn't dismiss it. She was beginning, in the small, frightened, awake part of herself that the daylight hadn't reached yet, to understand that she wasn't supposed to. Chapter 3. What the Cold Keeps. She found out his name, the way you find out most things in Harlan's Creek, accidentally, through someone else's conversation. Saturday morning. The hardware store on Clement Street, which also sold birdseed and propane and, inexplicably, a rotating rack of romance novels near the register. Mara was there for weather stripping because the cold was coming in under her back door in a way that had stopped being charming and started being expensive. She was crouched in the third aisle reading the back of a package when she heard Donna Fitch, Patsy's actual Patsy, the owner's wife, talking to someone at the front counter. Sale Debra, the older one. He's been back maybe 2 weeks. Nobody knows why. Mara did not move from her crouch. Thought they were done with this valley, the other voice said. Male. Older. She placed it after a moment as Ray Hollis, who ran the auto shop on Route 9 and had once changed her tire in a sleet storm without charging her. I thought so too. Donna's voice dropped, which, in a hardware store with bad acoustics, still carried fine. His father made a mess of things before he left. The family's they're not easy people, Ray, the boys especially. He give you trouble? No. No, he was perfectly polite. That's almost worse, isn't it? A pause. The register beeped. He asked about the Voss place. Donna said, quieter now. The rental out on Miller Road. The weather stripping package crinkled in Mara's hand. She set it down carefully. What'd you tell him? That a school teacher lives there. What else would I tell him? Mara stood up, took the weather stripping, and went to the register by the back route, through the plumbing aisle. By the time she reached the front, Ray Hollis was gone, and Donna was alone, tying a display of work gloves with the brisk efficiency of someone who had just said something they were already reconsidering. Morning, Mara. Morning. She set the package on the counter, tried to make her voice light. Who were you just talking about? I think I heard you mention Miller Road. Donna's hands went still on the gloves for just a half second. A practiced stillness, not guilt exactly, but the careful rearrangement of someone deciding how much was appropriate to share. New person in town, she said. Nobody you'd know. That'll be $4.80. Mara paid and left and sat in her cold car and turned the name over. Cale Devereaux. It sat in her mouth with the weight of something that had been waiting to be spoken. She should have gone home. The weather stripping was sitting on her passenger seat, and the back door was letting in a draft that was costing her approximately $15 a month in heat, and there was no good reason to drive to the north end of town, where the older houses backed up against the first rise of the mountain. She went anyway. She wasn't certain what she expected to find. Maybe nothing. Maybe the compulsion would exhaust itself at the end of Devereaux Road, which was where the name led her. A county road she'd never had reason to take that wound uphill through bare-limbed oaks and ended at an iron gate that was standing open. Beyond the gate, a gravel drive. At the end of the drive, a house that was large and very old and had the particular quality of a place that had been empty for years and was only recently, reluctantly inhabited again. One window lit on the ground floor. She stopped the car at the gate, engine running. She was not going to drive up. She was simply going to look. Note that it existed. Turn around. The front door opened. He stood in the frame for a moment, and she understood with cold certainty that he had heard the car. Had probably heard it from further away than should have been possible. He wasn't wearing a jacket despite the temperature which registered in her mind as a small, sharp, wrong note. His expression, even at this distance, was the same composed stillness she'd seen in the diner, looking at the wall, looking at her. The quality of attention was identical. He came down the porch steps. Mara's hand moved to the gear shift and stopped. Running felt wrong. Not unsafe, just wrong. Like it would be a different kind of admission than staying. He reached the gate and stopped on his side of it. Up close, he was taller than the diner had suggested, or the space there had compressed him somehow. And there was something about the way he stood that she kept trying to name and couldn't. A quality of restraint, like stillness, was a choice he was making continuously and consciously, the way you hold a door shut against wind. You drove past twice, he said. I wasn't counting. I was. She looked at him. He looked at her. The coin sensation in her chest had become something heavier, denser, a pressure she was aware of with each breath. Your name is Cale Devereaux, she said. Something moved across his face. Not surprise, something older and less readable. You've been asking about me. I overheard. That's different. She paused. You asked about my house. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the oaks above them with a sound like paper tearing slowly. I wanted to know who was living there, he said finally. Why? Another pause. Longer. He looked at her with those pale amber eyes, and she had the distinct and irrational impression that he was weighing something, not the words exactly, but the decision beneath the words, whether to hand her a version of the truth or a door that looked like one. It's close to the boundary, he said. The word dropped into the space between them and sat there. Her dream came back to her, the seam in the forest floor, the map of a place she'd been walking blindly. Here. This is where one thing becomes another. What boundary, she said. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked away, out past the gate toward the tree line on the far side of the road, and the muscle in his jaw shifted. You should go home, he said. Fix whatever you came here to fix. I came here because... She stopped. Because what? She didn't have an answer that would survive being spoken aloud. I know why you came, he said quietly, not unkindly. That was the thing that unsettled her most. There was nothing unkind in his voice, only a weariness that sounded structural, load-bearing, the kind built up over a long time. Go home, Mara. Her name in his mouth was precise and careful, like he had been practicing restraint around it. She put the car in reverse. She didn't argue, didn't ask how he knew her name when she hadn't given it, didn't acknowledge the way the pressure in her chest sharpened when she increased the distance between them. A sensation like a cord pulled taut. She drove home, installed the weather stripping, did it badly the first time and had to redo the corner seal. She kept hearing her name in his voice, that terrible, careful precision, like it cost him something to say it. Chapter 4. Things that don't heal clean. She looked him up the way anyone would. Sunday afternoon, laptop on the kitchen table, tea going cold beside it. Devereux, Harlan's Creek, Pennsylvania. The results were thin and old. A property record, a brief mention in a 2009 County Historical Digest about founding families of the valley, a grainy photograph in the archived digital edition of the local paper from 2011 that showed a man she didn't recognize accepting some kind of land conservation award. The caption read, Thomas Devereux, representing the Devereux family holdings in the Northern Valley. The man in the photo was broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and smiling with the particular ease of someone who had never needed to practice it. He looked nothing like Yale. She searched the name alone. Hale Devereux, nothing. Not a social media profile, not a professional listing, not a single digital footprint that would indicate a person living in the current century. She tried variations. C. Devereux family, Pennsylvania Wolves, and stopped on that last one, with her fingers hovering over the keys, unsure when she'd typed the final word. She deleted it, closed the laptop. Outside, the first real snow of the season was beginning to fall. Monday came with 4 inches on the ground, and the particular silence that snow imposed on the valley, a muffled, attentive quiet that made everything feel closer and more significant than it was. School was delayed 2 hours. Mara drove in on roads that the county had salted but not fully cleared, and the trees along Miller Road wore the snow in heavy sleeves that bent the lower branches almost to the ground. She didn't see the wolf. She didn't see Kale. She told herself this was a relief. Tracy from the neighboring classroom caught her in the hallway between periods with the bright conspiratorial energy she reserved for town news. Did you hear about the Devereux property? Apparently someone's been up there. Lights on, smoke from the chimney. Ray Hollis says it's the son, the older one, Kale. She said the name with a slight emphasis, testing it. People are a little, you know how people are, uneasy, Mara offered. His father left badly. There was a whole thing with the Harker family, the ones with the land that backs up against the state forest. Some kind of dispute. It apparently got physical. Tracy lowered her voice though they were alone in the hallway, not like a fist fight, like, I don't know. Donna Fitch won't say exactly, but she looks strange when you press her on it. Strange how? Frightened, but trying not to be. Tracy straightened. Anyway, new drama. I thought you'd want to know since you're out there on Miller Road. Mara thanked her. Went back to her classroom, sat at her desk through the 10-minute break, and thought about the Harker family whose land backed up against the state forest, which was also where the boundary was, which was the word Kale had used standing at his gate in the cold without a jacket like temperature was a thing that happened to other people. She found the mark on her back door that evening. She almost missed it. She was checking the weather stripping she'd installed badly and redone, running her finger along the lower seal, when she noticed the carving just above the door's exterior frame. Small, deliberate, cut into the wood with something sharp, a circle with a single line through it, bisected at an angle that made it look less like a symbol and more like a wound that had been made very carefully. She took a photograph of it, went inside, sat at the kitchen table and looked at the photograph and tried to locate herself in the feeling. Whether it was fear, whether it was anger, whether it was something else that she didn't have a clean name for. She drove to the Devereux gate in the dark. This time, she didn't stop at the gate. She drove up the gravel to the house and parked and knocked on the front door with more force than was strictly polite. The sound traveled in the cold and the snow swallowed it. He opened the door. He looked at her face and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. Again, never surprise. But a tightening around the eyes that she was beginning to understand was his version of it. There's a mark on my door, she said, on the outside of the back door, carved into the wood. He was very still. I want to know what it means. Mara, don't. Her voice came out sharper than she intended, and she didn't soften it. You know what it is. You know what the boundary is. You asked about my house before you'd ever met me. I'd like one answer that isn't a direction to go home. He looked at her for a long time. The light from inside fell across him in a way that made the weariness in his face more visible, that structural thing. Load-bearing, deep-rooted. Then he stepped back from the door. She went inside. The house was sparsely furnished in the way of a place not yet decided upon. A couch, a table, books stacked on the floor along one wall in columns that reached her hip. The books were old and some of them had titles she didn't recognize in languages she didn't speak. A fire was going. The room smelled like pine and wood smoke, and underneath those things, that other cold mineral scent from the envelope. He sat in the chair across the fire from where she'd chosen the end of the couch. He rested his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor between them. "It's a territorial marker," he said. "It means someone has claimed the land." "My land." "The land around your land. The mark on the door is a warning to others." He paused. "To stay out." "Others," she said. "You mean others like you?" He looked up at her then, direct. That pale amber gaze, she held it. "How long have you known about me? Specifically, before you came back." His jaw moved. "A while." "How long is a while?" "Mara." Her name again, that careful precision. "There are things I can't tell you yet, not because I'm protecting myself." A pause, weighted and deliberate. "Because knowing them changes things for you in ways that can't be undone. That's not your choice to make." "No," he agreed quietly. "It isn't." The fire shifted. A log settling. The snow outside had resumed, visible through the window behind him, falling in slow, deliberate lines through the dark. "The mark on the door," she said. "It was put there to protect me." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. "Who put it there, Cale?" The silence stretched between them, and in the silence she understood something she didn't want to understand, that the care being taken around her, the watching, the note, the boundary, the mark, was not the care of a stranger. It was too specific, too old, too practiced. "You should know," he said finally, "that I tried not to come back." She looked at him across the fire, the weariness in his face, the restraint in every line of him, the cost of sitting this close to her that she could see but not yet name. "What are you?" she said softly. He looked into the fire. "Something you can't unknow." Chapter 5, The Sound Before the Break. She didn't sleep that night, not because of fear. Or not only that, she lay in the dark of her bedroom listening to the snow settle against the roof and turn the conversation over the way you turn a stone you found, looking for what's underneath, something you can't unknow. The way he'd said it without drama, without theater, as a plain statement of dimension. Like a doctor giving a measurement. She thought about the books on his floor, the languages she hadn't recognized, the fact that he'd been outside in December without a jacket twice now and hadn't seemed to notice. She thought about the wolf. She was not a person who believed in the irrational. She had grown up in a practical house, her mother a nurse, her father a civil engineer, and had been trained from early on to locate the mechanism behind the mystery, the prosaic explanation beneath the strange surface. She was good at this. It had served her well. It was failing her now, and she knew it, and the knowing kept her awake until the sky outside her window went from black to the deep blue-gray of very early morning. She got up and made coffee and stood at the back door looking at the mark above the frame, a warning to others, to stay out. To stay out of what, exactly, she hadn't asked. She'd been so focused on the fact of the mark, the evidence of intention behind it, that she'd missed the obvious next question. Out of the house? Out of her life? Out of the territory that the boundary defined? She photographed it again in the better light. Then she went to school. The Harker property adjoined the state forest along its eastern edge. She'd looked at a county map that morning, found the parcel lines. The Devereaux land ran along the northern edge of the same forest, higher up the mountain. Between them and the forest and her rental on Miller Road, a rough triangle of territory she now understood differently than she had a week ago. She did not drive past the Harker property. She taught her classes. She ate lunch at her desk and looked at the county map on her laptop and did not search for anything supernatural. Tracy found her again at 3:15, and this time Tracy's bright conspiratorial energy had curdled into something with more weight to it. "Something happened at the Harker place last night," she said, quiet now. Door closed behind her. "I don't know exactly what, but Dale Harker called Ray Hollis this morning and apparently there was damage. along the fence line at the back of their property, where it meets the forest. Mara kept her voice even. What kind of damage? Ray said the fence posts were broken, not cut, not knocked down. Broken, like something ran through them. Tracy paused. Dale Harker thinks it's the Devereaux. He's saying it's the same as what happened with the father years ago, that they come back and they start marking things, pressing on the edges. Pressing on the edges, Mara repeated. His words. I don't know what they mean. But Tracy's face said she had a guess. Just, you're out there, on Miller Road, and you're alone out there. I wanted you to know. Mara thanked her. Drove home on Miller Road watching the tree line. The snow on the fields was unmarked and white and gave nothing away. He was at her gate, not the wolf. Him. Cale. Standing at the end of her drive with his hands in his jacket pockets. He was wearing a jacket today, she noticed, which meant yesterday's absence of one had been a choice or an oversight or something else, looking at the road rather than the house. He turned when her headlights found him. She pulled up and lowered the window. You broke the Harkers' fence. No. Someone did. Along the forest edge of their property, last night, something hardened in his face. That wasn't me. A pause. Can I come in? It wasn't entirely a question. She drove up to the house, and he followed on foot, which, given the length of her drive, should have meant she reached the door well before him. He was at the porch steps when she got out of the car. Inside, he stood in her kitchen and looked at the back door from this side. At the mark above the frame, his expression did what she was learning to read as the visible fraction of a much larger internal weather. The Harker fence, he said. Which direction did the break come from? From inside the forest, I assume, Tracy didn't say. It came from inside the forest. He said it like a confirmation of something he'd already known. Then he pulled out the chair at her kitchen table and sat down, which was the first time he'd sat in her space, and the difference it made to the room was something she felt before she thought about it. He was occupying her ordinary life. The kitchen light fell on him the same way it fell on her dishes and her coat on the hook by the door and the stack of papers she'd been meaning to grade since Wednesday. It made him more real. It also made everything more serious. Tell me, she said. She sat across from him. Not a piece of it, not a measurement of what I can handle. Tell me. He looked at his hands on her table, then at her. There are packs, he said. Old ones, in this valley. The Devereaux and the Harkers are the two that remained after the others consolidated or left. They've held a WAW between them, a boundary agreement, territory lines that neither crosses. He paused. My father broke it 15 years ago. He crossed into Harker territory during a dominance dispute and it ended badly for both families. When he left, the agreement was suspended, not broken, suspended. And you came back to, what? Reinstate it? To finish it. His voice was flat with the effort of plainness. The Harkers have a new alpha. Younger, he doesn't want the old agreement, he wants the Northern Territory. Devereaux land. He paused. Your land is inside Devereaux territory. That's why I asked about the house. That's why the mark is on your door. Mara absorbed this. And the fence. The Harker Alpha sending a message, showing he'll push the boundary. His jaw tightened. He knows I'm back. He knows I haven't fully reasserted the claim. He's testing the edge. With me on it. Yes. The word landed clean and without softening, and she appreciated that, the absence of the cushion, the plain acknowledgement that she was inside something with real edges and real stakes. The moon binding, she said, not knowing entirely where the phrase came from, the dream, perhaps, or the books on his floor seen in peripheral vision. Is that part of this? The stillness that came over him was different from his ordinary stillness, deeper, like something had stopped moving far below the surface. Where did you hear that? I didn't hear it. She stopped. I dreamed it. He looked at her for a long time. The kitchen felt smaller than it had when she'd walked in. The distance between them across the table felt at the same time too small and load-bearing, structural, a gap that was working very hard to remain a gap. Mara. His voice had changed. lower, rougher at the edge, the restraint in it tighter and more visible than it had ever been. How long have you been dreaming about the forest? She opened her mouth. The back window shattered. Chapter 6. What the moon already knows. The stone that came through the window was not a stone. Mara understood this in the 2 seconds after the glass exploded inward, while she was still pushing back from the table, chair legs shrieking against the tile floor, one arm up against the spray of cold air and glass dust. It had the shape of a stone and the weight of one when it struck the far wall and dropped to the floor. But it was wrapped, bound with something dark and fibrous, dried plant matter wound tightly around it in a spiral, and even across the kitchen she could smell it. Something burnt and organic and deeply wrong, a smell that had no clean category in her experience but that her body recognized and recoiled from before her mind caught up. Sale was already at the window. He didn't go to the window the way a person goes to a window. He moved the way the wolf had moved on Route 9. With a purpose so absolute it bypassed any intermediate step between decision and arrival. He had the back door open before the last fragment of glass had finished settling, and he was outside, and then he was gone, swallowed by the dark of the yard without a sound. Mara stood in her kitchen, glass on the tile, cold air pouring through the empty window frame, the wrapped stone against the baseboard, trailing its spiral of dried matter. She did not touch it. She stood perfectly still and listened. Outside, nothing. Then, at the far edge of the yard near the tree line, a sound she felt more than heard, a low reverberation that moved through the floor of the house and up through her feet and into her sternum where the coin pressure had lived for days. Not a sound from any animal she had a name for, a sound that was old in the way that certain things are old, not aged, but prior, belonging to an earlier layer of the world than the one she was standing in. Then silence. Then Cale came back through the door. He was breathing, not hard, not ragged, but with a deliberateness that told her the breathing was managed, not natural. His jacket was gone. She didn't know when that had happened. There were 2 parallel marks across his left forearm, dark against the skin, already beginning to close at the edges in a way that marks did not close in the 2 minutes since she'd last seen him. She looked at his arm. She looked at his face. He looked back at her with those pale amber eyes and said nothing and did not look away, and she understood this was its own kind of answer to the question she'd been circling for a week. "Sit down," she said. "Let me look at that." "It's fine." "Cale." She used his name the same way he used hers, carefully, with intention. "Sit down." He sat at the kitchen table. She got the first aid kit from under the bathroom sink, which was optimistic given the depth of the marks, but gave her hands something to do, and she came back and sat across from him and looked at the arm he placed on the table between them. The marks were already half closed. As she watched, the tissue at the edges drew together with a slow, organic certainty that had nothing to do with any biological process she'd been taught. She pressed a clean cloth against it anyway and held it there and looked at his face. "Tell me what that was," she said. "The thing through the window." "A territorial offense. The Harker Alpha, his name is Soren, he's escalating." Ciel's voice was steady, though the muscle in his jaw was doing that thing. "The binding on the stone is old pack craft. A message that says the ward on your door is contested." Can he do that? Contest it? If the Alpha who placed the ward hasn't fully reinstated his claim, yes. Under the old laws, a ward without a standing claim behind it is hollow. He paused. "Soren knows I've been here 2 weeks without making a formal claim of territory. He's correct that the ward is technically unsupported." Mara lifted the cloth. The marks had almost fully closed. She pressed it back down. "What does a formal claim involve?" His jaw tightened in a way that was different from before. Not the contained weather version. Something more specific. It's not a simple thing. Most things aren't. Mara. He said her name and stalked, looked at the cloth she was holding against his arm. The distance across the table was doing its load-bearing work, and she could feel the effort of it from his side, a kind of resistance that was physical and present and in the room with them. "There's something I need to tell you before I tell you about the claim." She waited. "The reason I came back to the valley," he said, "it wasn't only about the territory." "I know." He looked up. You said you tried not to come back, she said. You don't try not to do things that are only about territory disputes. You try not to do things that are about something you don't want to face. She held his gaze. What am I to you? Specifically, the fire from the other room threw a long stripe of light across the kitchen floor between them. Outside, the snow had resumed. The window frame breathed cold air into the room. The moon binding, he said at last, is a law that's older than the pack agreements. Older than the territorial lines. It's the way the bond between mates is recognized. Under the old laws, it doesn't require ceremony, it doesn't require consent in the formal sense. His voice had gone very quiet. The moon marks the pairing. The alpha's blood recognizes it. There's no negotiating with it once it's active. Mara was very still. How long has it been active? For me. He looked at his hands. Since before I left the valley. Years ago. The kitchen settled around this information. The clock above the stove marked its small, indifferent seconds. You left, you said. Yes. And then you came back. The Harkers forced my hand, and he stopped. And you wanted to, she said softly. He didn't answer. His silence was its own kind of rawness, exposed at the edges, the restraint of a very controlled person who had run out of room to be controlled. I haven't shifted near you, he said instead. I've been careful about that. You haven't. The bond on your side, I don't know if it's... I've been dreaming about the forest for 3 months, she said. I wake up at 4 in the morning knowing exactly where you are on my property. I drove to your gate twice. I drove to your house at night. She paused. I think you know which side the bond is on. He looked at her across the table. The amber eyes and the terrible weariness in them, and beneath the weariness, something that had been held still for a very long time and was only now, in this kitchen, in this light, beginning to move. There's more, he said. The moon binding, under the pack law, an unmated alpha's bond claim can be challenged by a rival. Soren knows. He looked at the broken window. He knows, and he's not contesting the territory. She understood a moment before he said it. He's contesting you. Chapter 7. The cost of kindness used as a weapon. She didn't fully process it that night. There was too much that needed doing. The window, primarily. Hale found a piece of plywood in her shed and cut it to fit while she swept glass, and he didn't ask where her tools were, which meant he knew where they were, which meant he'd been in her shed at some point, and she filed that away with everything else that was accumulating in the folder, labeled things about this that should frighten me more than they do. They worked in the kitchen, in a silence that was not uncomfortable. He knew how to use a drill. She held the plywood flat against the frame while he secured it, and the cold air stopped, and the kitchen felt like a room again. She made tea. He sat at the table with his hands around the mug the same way he'd sat with the coffee at Patsy's, and she thought, he does that when he's thinking. Uses the warmth as a tether. She filed that away too. He left at 11 without fanfare, stood up, said lock both doors, looked at her for a long moment in which the distance between them was working harder than it ever had, and then went out into the snow. She watched the yard from the plywood-covered window that showed her nothing, and then went to bed and slept, heavily and completely, for the first time in days. In the morning there were tracks in the snow along the outer edge of her property. Wolf tracks. Large, deliberate, following the property line with a precision that was its own kind of message. Not threatening, not approaching, only marking. Saying, I was here, I am here, the claim holds. She photographed those too. She was beginning to have quite an archive. He came by Thursday evening with a new pane of glass for the window and the specific wordless competence of someone who had been fixing things alone for a long time. She made dinner while he worked. Pasta, simple. The kind of cooking that gave her hands something to do without requiring thought. And when he finished, she put a bowl in front of him and sat across the table, and he ate without commenting on it. And she thought this was probably the most domestic thing that had happened to her in 4 years. They talked not about Soren, not about the bond, but about smaller things. She asked about the books. He told her about his mother's family, older than the valley itself, who had kept records going back further than the county's written history. She asked about the languages, and he told her 2 were old German variants, and one was something older than that, a regional tongue that no one spoke conversationally anymore. Did you have a normal childhood, she asked. Alongside all of this, something moved in his face that was almost amusement. Almost. No. Fair. Did you? He asked, and it was the first personal question he directed at her, and it landed differently than she expected, with a warmth beneath it, a genuine wanting to know. And she found herself talking about her mother, and the practical house, and the civil engineer father, and the way she'd always felt slightly sideways to the world around her, as though she were tuned to a frequency that the room she was in wasn't broadcasting. He listened the way he did everything, with complete, held attention. That feeling, he said when she finished, the sideways thing. That's not incidental for you. She looked at him. What does that mean? It means the bond doesn't come from nowhere. It finds a resonance that already exists. He paused. You've always been close to the edge of this world, even before I came back. She sat with this. Is that supposed to be comforting? I don't know what it's supposed to be. It's just true. She almost smiled. He almost did too. The almost smile on his face was something she wanted to look at for longer than was reasonable, and she looked at her pasta instead. He left at 9. She stood on the porch and watched him walk down the drive and thought that this specific thing, this careful incremental thing they were building across kitchen tables and broken windows, was the most frightened she had been yet. Not of Soren, of this. Friday she came home to find his car at her gate and him standing beside it with an expression she hadn't seen before, closed in a different way. Not the contained weather version or the load-bearing restraint version. This was deliberate, constructed. She knew before she got out of the car that something had changed. We need to talk, he said. Inside, standing in the kitchen, not sitting. He stayed near the door. She noticed this. The specific geography of it, the distance maintained, the way he wasn't touching any surface that was hers. Soren made a formal challenge, he said. This morning, delivered through a third party, which is how these things are done. He paused. A challenge under the old law gives me a specific window to either make a full bond claim or to formally cede the contest. She waited. If I make the full claim, he said, it places you inside the pack law. Fully, it makes you a target of the challenge by name. Soren can't contest the territory then. He contests the bond directly. It puts you in the middle of something that could become. The danger would be real and immediate. And if you cede, she said, the territory dispute goes to arbitration under the old agreements. It becomes a boundary matter again, not a bond matter. He looked at the window he'd repaired. If I cede the bond contest specifically, formally tells a law that there is no active bond claim, Soren has no reason to focus on you. You'd be outside the dispute. She was quiet for a moment. Can you do that? Cede a moon binding. You can't undo it, he said carefully, but you can decline to act on it. Under the law, an unclaimed bond is legally dormant. A pause. Soren wouldn't accept a lie. He can sense an active claim, so I would need to distance myself enough that the bond reads as dormant. Distance yourself, she repeated. Leave the property. Leave Miller Road's perimeter. Create enough distance that the resonance settles. He said the word like it tasted of something. She understood then. All of it. The constructed expression. The geography of where he was standing. He had already decided. He'd come to tell her, not to ask her. You were going to do this without telling me, she said. I'm telling you now. You were going to make it clean, she said. Remove yourself. Let the bond go dormant. Let me go back to being a schoolteacher on Miller Road who had a strange few weeks. Her voice was even, and she hated that it was even, and I wouldn't have known what had been taken. The muscle in his jaw. It protects you. It uses my safety as a reason to make a decision that is also, significantly, about you not wanting to be the reason I'm in danger. She looked at him. Those are different things. He said nothing, which was admission. You don't get to do that, she said quietly. You don't get to use kindness as the instrument, take something away from me and call it protection. She held his gaze. I know what the bond is now. You told me. Which means you don't get to treat me like I don't. The kitchen was very quiet, the clock above the stove. the snow outside. "If I make the claim," he said, "you understand what comes next. Tell me." Soren won't wait for arbitration. He'll move against the territory directly, probably within the full moon window, 4 days. She looked at him standing near her door with his constructed expression coming apart at the edges, and the weariness underneath it, and beneath the weariness, that thing that had been held still for a long time. 4 days, she said. Then we have 4 days. Chapter 8. Everything the dark holds, the 4 days had a different quality than ordinary time. Mara noticed this the way you notice a change in air pressure, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulated small evidence. The way light fell differently through her windows, the way sounds carried further or seemed to, the way she woke each morning already alert, already oriented, as though sleep had become a lighter country she was passing through rather than inhabiting. Kale was at her property every night, sometimes at the tree line, sometimes closer. She stopped pretending not to know he was there and started leaving the porch light on, which was a small thing and said everything. He came inside on Saturday evening, and they sat by the fire, and he told her about the moon binding in full, not the legal framework this time, but the older story beneath it, how the bond was not chosen but recognized, how the moon, in the old pack understanding, was not a symbol but a witness, how it marked the pairing and the blood didn't negotiate. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "The shift." He considered the question seriously, which she'd come to understand was his only mode. The first times, not anymore. A pause. "It's more like a pressure that releases, like holding your breath for a very long time." She thought about the sound she'd heard through the floor on the night the window broke, the low reverberation that had no category. "Will you?" She stopped. "Yes," he said. "Before the full moon. You should see it. You need to understand what you're choosing to stand beside." The fire moved. She nodded once. Sunday passed in preparation. Kale made calls. She heard his voice through the wall of the room she'd given him use of, low and unhurried, in the cadences of someone who was assembling something. He had allies in the valley, she understood, not pack. The Devereaux pack had scattered when his father left, but individuals who held the old agreements as binding, people who remembered. She graded papers. The normalcy of this struck her periodically with a force that was almost comic. She was annotating 7th grade essays about the outsiders while a werewolf made phone calls in her spare room about a territorial challenge scheduled for the full moon in 2 days. Tracy texted in the afternoon. Dale Harker filed something with the county about the fence. "Are you okay out there?" "Fine," Mara wrote back. Pipe burst. Had a friend stay over to? She was not sure when Cole had become a friend. Exactly, or whether that was the right word, or whether any word she had was adequate. Monday evening, 2 hours before midnight. They were in the back field, which was Mara's idea. She wanted the open ground, not the enclosed dark of the forest. The snow had compacted into a crust that caught the moonlight, the moon one night from full and already enormous, already heavy with intention. She could feel it pressing on the underside of something in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet, but was learning the shape of. Shale stood 10 feet away from her in the field. He'd taken off his jacket. She'd told him she wanted to see, and he'd said, "Are you certain?" And she'd said yes with the kind of certainty that lived below the rational, in the part of you that knows things before you know them. He looked at her for a long moment, the moonlight on his face, the weariness, and beneath it that slow-moving thing. "Stay there," he said quietly. She stayed. What happened next was not what she'd braced for, not violent, not monstrous, not the rupture she'd half expected from every piece of received fiction she'd absorbed over a lifetime. It was more like watching a translation, one true thing becoming another true thing. The sound was that low reverberation again, felt through the frozen ground and up through her boots, and then there was the wolf, the charcoal wolf with the pale amber eyes, standing in the snow where Kale had been standing. It was larger than she'd understood from the road. Up close, the scale of it was genuinely staggering, shoulder height nearly level with her sternum, the breadth of it, the absolute physical fact of it. It looked at her. She looked back. The coin pressure in her chest resolved suddenly and completely into something so simple it almost made her laugh. Recognition. Pure and uncomplicated. The same recognition she felt hearing her name and his voice for the first time. The same recognition as the dream and the 4 a.m. certainty and all the rest of it. "There you are," said some part of her that didn't use words. "I've been waiting a very long time." She took 3 steps forward through the snow and put her hand on the wolf's head and felt the warmth of him and the slight tremor that moved through him at her touch, the restraint. Even in this form, even now, that long-practiced held-breath stillness. "I see you," she said softly. "Both of you." He was himself again within minutes. He stood in the snow looking at her, and his face was undone in the way of someone who had prepared for many outcomes, and not this one. Not this simple, unfrightened acceptance. The constructed expressions were gone. All of them. What remained was the thing underneath, exposed entirely, and it was not frightening. It was just him. She crossed the remaining distance between them, and he went very still in the way that was different from all his other stillnesses. Not restraint, not management, but arrested motion, like something had stopped time in the specific place where she was standing. Mara, her name. That careful precision, but the care was different now. Not the care of holding something at distance, but of holding something close without breaking it. "I know," she said. He brought his hand up and touched her face with the same deliberateness he did everything, and she turned into it slightly, the way you turn toward warmth. And the bond that had been a coin, and then a cord, and then a pressure in the room between them settled into her chest like something coming home. They were inside and by the fire when his phone rang. He looked at the screen and something shifted in his face, the sharp, directed focus of the alpha. She was only beginning to understand the full dimensions of the part of him that was not the quiet man at the kitchen table, but the thing that had made a sound through the frozen ground and sent Soren's messenger back across the boundary line without a word. "Soren moved early," he said. "How early?" He was already standing, already reaching for his jacket. "Tonight. He's not waiting for the full moon." He looked at her. "He's bringing the rogue faction, the ones who don't hold the old agreements as binding. They're not interested in arbitration." "How many?" 6, maybe 8. He paused at the door. "I have 3 people coming, plus me." The math was not comfortable. "My allies can hold the northern boundary," he said, "but Soren will come for the house. He knows the bond claim was made. He'll target you directly, disrupt the claim at its source." She stood up from the fire. "Then I don't stay at the house." "Mara, you said he comes for the source of the claim." She met his eyes. "I'm the source of the claim. If I'm not here, he's not here. He follows me, and you follow him, and your 3 people hold the northern boundary, and Soren is separated from his faction." He stared at her. "That puts you directly in front of him. It puts him directly in front of you." She held his gaze. "You said 4 days. We have 2. I'm not going to spend them in the house waiting to be a problem you have to protect me from." She reached for her coat. "I'm going to be the thing that ends this." The fire snapped behind her. Outside, deep in the forest, something howled, long and rising, a sound that was declaration rather than warning. Cale looked at her for a long moment with all his constructed distance completely gone. "Stay close to me," he said. "Always," she said, and surprised herself with how much she meant it. They went out into the dark together. Chapter 9. The name for what this is. The forest at night was nothing like the forest in daylight. Mara had understood this abstractly, had known that the tree line she watched from her window was a different thing once you were inside it, but knowing it and standing inside it at 11 at night with the full moon 1 day away and the snow crust glowing faint blue-white between the trunks were 2 different orders of experience. The trees were enormous up close, the silence had texture. Every branch creak and snowfall and distant sound occupied the dark with a presence that the open field had not prepared her for. Cale moved through it like he was reading a language she didn't speak yet. Unhurried but exact, choosing each step with the precision of someone who had walked this ground so many times it lived in his body rather than his memory. He kept her slightly behind his shoulder, not in front, not trailing, and she understood this was a deliberate geometry, close enough to reach, shielded from the forward direction. She watched his back and thought about the field and his face undone in the moonlight, and the warmth of the bond settled in her chest and kept walking. They had been moving through the forest for 20 minutes when he stopped. She stopped beside him. He was reading the dark ahead, not with his eyes exactly, or not only with his eyes. His head was slightly lifted, that stillness again, the architectural quality of it. "He's ahead," Cale said quietly. 40 yards. He came alone. You said 6 to 8. He left them at the northern boundary. A feint. Something moved in his jaw. He's smarter than his father was. I'll give him that. Is that good or bad? For us right now, bad. He turned to look at her. The moonlight through the canopy put half his face in shadow. He wants to talk before he fights, which means he thinks he has something to say that changes your position. My position. You're the bond claim. He'll make an argument directly to you. Cale paused. You don't have to listen. I'll listen, she said. You learn more from what people try to sell you than from what they admit. Something moved across his face. Not the almost smile, the real one, small and unguarded, here and gone. She filed it in the folder she kept for things she wanted to look at again. They walked on. Soren Harker was not what she'd built in her imagination. She had constructed something brutal from the evidence, the broken fence posts, the stone through her window, the threat of the challenge delivered through a third party. She had expected brute force made human. He was perhaps 35, lean where Cale was broad, with a face that was sharp and watchful and not unintelligent. He stood in a small clearing between two old oaks with his hands loose at his sides, a posture she recognized as the deliberate non-aggression of someone who intended to use words first. His eyes were dark, and they went to her immediately, which she had expected, and stayed there, which she had not. You're Mara Voss, he said, conversational. You broke my window, she said. A brief pause. That was a communication. It was glass in my kitchen. Cale beside her said nothing. He was doing that held breath stillness, but with a different quality, not restraint of emotion but of action, a coiled readiness she could feel in the 3 inches of air between their arms. Soren looked at her with that sharp, watchful intelligence. He hasn't told you everything, he said, about what the bond claim means for you, about what you become inside the pack law once it's formalized. Tell me, she said. Under the old agreements, a bonded mate of a rival alpha is considered a strategic asset. If the Devereaux claim fails, in challenge, in arbitration, in any legal forum, you don't simply go back to your life. He paused. You become part of the resolution. A transfer of the bond, under the old law, is possible if the original alpha formally loses standing. She felt Cale go very still beside her in a new way. He knows this, Soren said. Not cruelly, informatively. He's known it since before he made the claim. He made it anyway. He tilted his head slightly. I'd ask yourself why he'd place you inside a law that puts you at risk if he loses, whether that's the act of someone protecting you. The clearing was quiet except for wind through the high branches. She looked at Soren for a moment. Then she looked at Soren. His face was doing that fractured thing, the constructed expressions completely unavailable. What remained, the raw, undisguised cost of what Soren had just said, landing in the open air between all 3 of them. He was not going to deny it. She could see him not denying it. The decision to absorb this rather than deflect it, and the sight of it was something she was going to have to sit with later in the quiet. She looked back at Soren. You're not wrong, she said, about the law. A pause. But you're making an argument about his motives from the inside of a framework you designed the incentives for? The law that makes me transferable is Harker law. Your family's interpretation? The Devereaux reading is different. I looked it up 3 days ago, in the books on his floor. She held Soren's gaze. Under the Devereaux precedent, a bond mate is a sovereign party, not an asset, not transferable. The dispute about which interpretation holds is exactly why your father and his father broke the original agreement, not over territory. Over this? Soren was very still. So you can keep the argument about his motives, she said. But you're going to need a different legal basis. A long silence. In the distance, a sound. Cale's allies, she thought, movement at the northern boundary that Soren could certainly hear. "You read the books," Soren said finally. "I'm a reading teacher," she said. "It's what I do." Something shifted in his face. Not defeat, recalculation. He looked at Kale. A long look with many layers she couldn't entirely parse. Then he looked back at her. "The window," he said. "I'll replace it." "I already replaced it," she said, "but I appreciate the acknowledgement." Soren looked at the ground between them for a moment. Then he turned and walked back into the trees, and the dark took him without drama. She stood in the clearing for a long moment after. Then Kale's hand found hers in the dark, not reaching, not grasping, just arriving, his fingers around hers with that same deliberateness that was the signature of everything he did. She held on. "You read the books," he said quietly. 3 days ago, when you were making calls in my spare room." She paused. "You were going to tell me about the transfer law." "Yes." "When?" "Tonight." "After." His hand tightened slightly around hers. "I didn't want it to be the reason you made your choice." She turned to look at him. The moonlight, and the shadow, and the undone face, and the thing beneath the weariness fully visible now, all the distance gone. Nothing between them but the 3 inches of cold air, and the bond settled warm in both their chests. Tail. His name. Careful and intentional and meaning all the things she was choosing to mean with it. "I made my choice in the kitchen the night you tried to leave to protect me. I made it before that, probably. I made it the morning I saw a wolf on Route 9 and didn't drive away." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said softly. "I know you did." "Then say the rest of it," she said. "What you haven't said. Say it out loud." The wind moved through the high branches. The moon pressed against the canopy. "You are my mate," he said, quiet and absolute and without armor. "You have been since before I deserved to say it. And I have been afraid of what that costs you. Every day since I understood it." "I know," she said. "I know you have." She stepped into the 3 inches of cold air between them, and he brought both arms around her with the careful, absolute certainty of someone who had been holding this moment at distance for a very long time and was finally completely done doing that. They stood in the clearing while the forest breathed around them. The bond in her chest was warm and steady and entirely at rest. For the first time since the deer on the roadside, since the wolf across the road, since the note on her porch step, she was not watching the dark for what it held. She already knew, Chapter 10, what the old law requires. They heard the northern boundary before they reached it, not the howling that had stopped 20 minutes ago, replaced by something worse, a silence that had the specific quality of held breath before impact. She had learned in the past week to read the forest silences the way she read a classroom, the difference between thinking quiet and trouble quiet, between absence and pressure. This was pressure. The whole northern tree line felt like something about to release. Sale's 3 allies were at the ridge when they arrived. She learned their names over the past 2 days. Petra, who was compact and gray-eyed and had the economical manner of someone who had been doing difficult things for a long time. 2 brothers named Lev and Daniel, who were younger, quieter, and deferred to Petra in the automatic way of lung habit. They were at the ridgeline in human form, which Mara had gathered was a deliberate choice. The formal challenge under Old Pack law began in human form. This was protocol. Ritual. 6, Petra said when they reached her. "Soren brought the full faction. He spoke to you?" "He made his case," Cal said. And Mara made a better one." His hand was still around hers. He didn't seem to notice he was still holding it. Petra noticed, and something in her gray eyes shifted. Not surprise, but something warmer. A long-held tension releasing. "The faction won't stop because Soren recalculated," Petra said. "Some of them aren't here for the legal argument. They're here for the territory." "I know." Cal looked at the tree line ahead. "The challenge is still required under the law. If I meet it formally, the faction has no standing to continue without Soren's lead. It becomes his decision entirely, and if Soren decides to push past the challenge result, then it's no longer a legal dispute." His voice was flat and calm. "And it becomes a different kind of conversation." Lev and Daniel exchanged a look that Mara had learned meant, "We knew it was going to come to this." The challenge ground was a specific place, She understood this when they moved through the last stand of trees onto a flat shelf of land just below the ridge, a natural clearing that the forest had maintained with a particular intentionality of places that had been used for something long enough to shape the land around them. The snow here was undisturbed except for tracks approaching from the north. The full moon was close enough now that it sat heavy and enormous above the ridge, not quite risen to its apex, throwing a light that was almost blue and absolutely merciless in its clarity. Soren was already there. He'd come back, as she had understood he would. Whatever his recalculation had been in the forest, he was still alpha of the Harker faction, and the challenge required his presence regardless of his personal conclusions. Behind him at the tree line, 5 figures she could see and feel rather than see clearly. The faction, waiting with the particular held-breath quality of the forest itself. Kale released her hand. She felt the absence of it immediately, the warmth gone, the bond in her chest pulling slightly in the direction of him. Not painfully, not desperately, just noting the distance the way a compass notes north. She stayed where she was, between Petra and the brothers, and watched. The 2 alphas faced each other across the clearing. The moon put both of them in that blue merciless light, and the sight of it was something old. She understood. The shape of it, the geometry of 2 claims meeting at the boundary of the thing they were both claiming, had happened in this valley or places like it for longer than the written records in those books went back. Soren spoke first, which was protocol. The challenger initiated. He spoke in the old language, the one older than the German variants, the regional tongue that no one spoke conversationally anymore. She couldn't follow the words, but she followed the cadence, which was formal and exact, each phrase placed with deliberate weight. A legal argument, she understood. The articulation of the Harker claim on the Northern Territory, the grounds for the challenge, the standing under the old agreements. When he finished, Sale answered. His voice in the old language was different than his voice in English, lower, with a resonance she felt in the sternum where the bond lived. Each word carrying the compacted authority of something being invoked rather than spoken. He was reciting precedent, she understood, the Devereux reading of the law, the sovereignty of the bond claim. The continuity of the family's holding through his return. It went on for several minutes. Petra, beside her, was following it with her eyes closed and her face intent. "What are they saying?" Mara said very quietly. "He's invoking the full lineage," Petra murmured. 3 generations of unbroken claim on the Northern Territory, the moon binding recognized under the original compact. Soren's challenge is procedurally valid, but substantively. She paused. Kale is going to win the legal argument. And then? Petra opened her eyes. Looked at the faction of the tree line. Depends on whether they accept it. The formal exchange ended. Soren was still for a long moment. Then he said something short in the old language, a single phrase, 2 words, that landed in the clearing with the weight of a verdict. Petra exhaled. "What was that?" Mara said. "Concession of the legal claim." Petra's voice was carefully neutral. He acknowledged the Devereux precedent. The Northern Territory holds. But the faction at the tree line had not moved. One of them, the largest standing slightly forward of the others, made a sound that needed no translation. A sound that said, "I didn't come here for the legal argument." Kale turned to look at him. The alpha attention, fully deployed, and even from 20 feet away, Mara felt the quality of it, the gathered force of it, the absolute undivided direction of it. The large figure at the tree line shifted, not gradually, the translation she'd witnessed in the field, one true thing becoming another, but at speed, with the urgency of aggression rather than the deliberateness of disclosure. And the wolf that emerged from it was darker than Kale's and heavier, and it was already moving across the clearing before the shift had fully completed. Kale moved. She had known, intellectually, from the books and the conversations and the evidence accumulated over 10 days, that he was an alpha-halfa, that the word meant something specific and weighted in this context. She had understood it the way you understand something from a description. She had not understood it the way she understood it now. The wolf that crossed the clearing to meet the charging figure was the charcoal wolf from Route 9, the wolf from her field, the wolf she had put her hand on and said, "I see you," and it was also something beyond that, something that occupied its own space with an authority that was not aggression, but was absolute. A force that said, "This ground is mine and has always been mine, and you are running towards something you cannot move." The collision happened in the center of the clearing, and it was brief, not because Kale was larger, the Harker wolf matched him in weight, because the authority was not physical. She had no cleaner way to frame it than that. The Harker wolf stopped. Not thrown, not pinned in any clean physical sense. Stopped, the way things stop when they encounter a boundary that is not negotiable. A long moment of absolute stillness between them. Then the Harker wolf backed, 1 step, 2, sat back on its haunches with the posture she now recognized, not defeat in the human sense, not humiliation, but the acknowledgement of a thing that the body knew before the will caught up. The faction at the tree line was still. Soren looked at Mara across the clearing. A long look, the sharp, watchful intelligence still present, something else in it too, something that might have been a different kind of recalculation. Then he said one word in English, clearly, directed at her. "Sovereign," he said. Her breath made a small ghost in the cold. She held his gaze and nodded once. He turned to his faction and spoke, the old language again, brief. And the faction, one by one, stepped back into the trees. The clearing was quiet. The moon sat at its apex above the ridge, full and enormous and absolutely present, flooding the challenge ground in blue-white light that made the snow into something like a mirror. In the center of it, the charcoal wolf stood with its head level and its breathing steady, and then the translation happened. The other direction this time, that reversal she had now witnessed twice, and Kale was standing in the snow in the moonlight, looking across the clearing at her. He looked at her the way he had in the field, undone, completely. She crossed the clearing to him. Chapter 11. What stays the morning after the full moon was a Tuesday. Mara knew this because she had papers to return to third period and a parent email she'd been putting off since Thursday, and the ordinary machinery of her life, which had continued operating without consultation during the past 10 days, was waiting for her with its customary indifference to what else had been happening. She lay in bed for a few minutes listening to it, the Tuesdayness of it, the particular quality of early winter light coming through curtains, the sound of the house settling in the cold. These were the same sounds she had woken to for 4 years. They were also different, not the sounds themselves, the quality of her attention to them. The sideways feeling was gone, not replaced by something louder, not resolved into some grand new orientation. Simply gone. Like a persistent sound you've lived with long enough that its absence is the thing you notice. She got up and went to the kitchen. Kale was at her table with coffee and the county map she'd been using, which he clearly found in the stack of papers she kept meaning to organize. He looked up when she came in. The morning light was uncomplicated and fell on him the same way it fell on the table and the cups and the plywood-covered window frame, which she still needed to replace with actual glass. She noted, making him ordinary and present, and entirely without the charged significance that every previous sighting of him had carried. He was just there, in her kitchen, on a Tuesday. The rightness of it was so simple it almost undid her. "Coffee," he said. Which was not a question. "Please," she said, which was not an answer to any question he technically asked, and sat down across from him. He stayed 3 more days before the conversation about longer became necessary. She didn't initiate it, and neither did he. It emerged the way the important conversations between them had always emerged, not through direct approach, but through accumulation, the thing becoming unavoidable by increments until it was simply present in the room and required acknowledgement. It was Thursday evening, fire going, the new window glass installed that afternoon by a contractor from the next town who had not asked about the plywood and whom she had paid in cash. Kale was on the couch with one of his books from the stack he'd brought over, which had migrated from the spare room to the living room to the table beside the couch in a way that had not been discussed. She was grating at the kitchen table. The domestic architecture of it was something she was still getting used to. Not uncomfortably, but with the specific, careful attention of someone learning the dimensions of a new space. "The Harker arbitration will take 6 weeks," he said, "at minimum." She looked up from her papers. "Meaning you need to be here. Meaning I need to be in the valley." "Yes." She looked at him. He looked at her with that direct amber gaze that no longer required interpretation. She had learned its register, the difference between its qualities, the specific shade of this one. "The house is a spare room," she said. "As you're aware, I'm aware. The books are already here, most of them." She looked back at her papers. Then that settled. A pause. She could feel him, not smiling, from across the room. Petra came by on Friday with a bottle of something she said was traditional and that tasted like wood smoke and winter berries and was probably not available commercially. They sat at the kitchen table, the three of them, and Petra told Mara about the valley's history with the comfortable authority of someone who had been its custodian for a long time, the original compact between the families, the years of the Devereux absence, the things she had maintained quietly in the interim. You held the northern boundary, Mara said. While he was gone, someone had to. Petra looked at Cale without accusation, simply with the frank directness of someone who loved a person and had also been quietly furious with them for years. He came back when he was ready. I came back when I had to, Ciel said. Same thing, in the end. Petra looked at Mara. He told you about the first time he saw you. Mara looked at Ciel. He was looking at the table with the expression of someone who had not expected this particular direction. He hasn't, she said. Petra, she should know. Petra's voice was entirely pleasant. You were in the valley 2 years ago, before you left again. You saw her at the hardware store on Clement Street. She picked up her glass. You called me from the parking lot, you said. What was it? The moon binding is active and I'm leaving the valley and I need you to watch the northern boundary. She smiled at Mara. He drove out that same afternoon. Mara looked at Cale. He was looking at her now. That weariness in his face, but different, lighter, the load-bearing quality of it redistributed now that it was shared. You saw me in the hardware store, she said. You were reading the back of a weather-stripping package, he said, very seriously. She thought about the hardware store in Clement Street. She had been there dozens of times. She tried to locate him in any of those visits and couldn't, but then she hadn't known to look. And you left the same day. The bond was immediate and strong. A pause. I hadn't decided yet what it meant to come back and make the claim, what it would cost you. So you spent 2 years deciding. Yes. And the answer you arrived at, she said, was to come back and immediately start trying to leave again. Petra made a sound that was probably a laugh, contained. I was still deciding, Cale said. You have a very long decision-making process. I'm aware. She held his gaze. The fire in the other room, the wood smoke and winterberry's warmth of Petra's bottle, the county map still on the table, his books on the side table in the living room. Well, she said, you're done now. Something in his face, the last structural thing, the last weight, settled, not collapsed, settled, the way something settles when it's placed correctly and finds its level. Yes, he said quietly, I am. In January, the arbitration began and took its 6 weeks and concluded with the boundary agreement redrawn and formalized in both the old legal language and the county recorder's office, which involved paperwork that Mara helped draft because Cale's relationship with administrative documentation was, as she put it, characteristically non-linear. He moved the rest of the books over in February. She still drove Miller Road to school every morning. The deer on Route 9 were only deer. The forest was the forest, green, dark, and patient, running north toward the mountain. She still woke at 4 some mornings. Not from certainty now, but from the bond checking, the way you might reach for a hand in the dark, the small, habitual warmth of knowing where someone is. He was always there. In March, she found a note on the kitchen table one morning, his handwriting, cramped, angular, slightly too controlled, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write carefully on purpose. Lock the front door. The Lev brothers are coming by at noon. There is coffee. She read it twice, the way she had read the first note on her porch step on a cold November evening that felt both 10 days and a lifetime ago. She set it down beside the coffee he'd left for her. Outside, the snow was melting off the fields. The tree line was the same dark patience it had always been, except that she knew what lived in it now and it knew her, and the boundary was drawn and held, and they were on the same side of it. She drank her coffee in the kitchen light. The sideways feeling was gone. She was exactly where she was supposed to be.